Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name is Joe Balcom. I'm the host of the program. Thanks for being with us. This is like number 73 or 74 shows for us. We're focusing on state and local issues of concern to Iowans. The topic tonight is air quality, and Iowa's air quality. Is it under assault or not? And a lot of people tend to think that Iowa's water is our biggest environmental concern. Our guest tonight is going to raise question with that. And our guest is Peter Hamlin. Peter's the Bureau Chief for Air Quality at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. He's been there for about 27 years, although he didn't look old enough to quite be there that long. Pete is one of our leading experts in Iowa on the question of air quality, and we're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Great. Thanks for being here. Pete, you were recently quoted in the Des Moines Register in an article in response to an Environmental Protection Agency report on air quality, saying that there's no doubt in your mind that we're exposed to more toxic materials in the air we breathe than in the water we drink. I think most Iowans be kind of shocked by a statement like that.
I think it's true. In fact, I know it's true. In fact, some recent studies that have been done by the Environmental Protection Agency show that every single census tract in Iowa exceeds the cancer benchmark for at least 7 hazardous air chemicals. So in every county in the state, in every community in the state, we're exposed to 7 toxic chemicals in the air we breathe that exceed federal cancer benchmark standards.
And we breathe a lot more air than we drink water, and
we drink at the most, if you're into running and things like that, maybe 2 liters of water a day. Mm-hmm. We breathe anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 liters of air a day.
I see. So significantly more. So there's an issue out there. The EPA's looked at and said every county in Iowa has an air quality issue. What are the sources of those air pollutants that the EPA has found in our air?
Okay. Now, EPA was looking at hazardous air pollutants only, and they did a national study using a computer model to look at what we're exposed to, and found that in Iowa we have at least 23 chemicals which exceed the cancer benchmark somewhere in the state. Mm-hmm. And we think that probably 60% of these problems come from automobile exhausts. Driving over from Des Moines, mm-hmm. I was putting toxic material into the air. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And about 25% probably comes from what we call area sources, which are smaller sources when lumped together cause problems. It could be dry cleaners, it could be gas stations, auto body shops, smaller facilities like that. And probably 15% come from major fixed facilities, big industries.
Sure. Well, let's talk about automobiles first. I know most of our viewers are not, they may want to click to another program at this point because we're going to talk about cars, which we all have and we all drive more and more and more, and we're all driving bigger and bigger cars that get less and less gas mileage. But what's going on with the automobile issue in terms of air emissions?
Well, I think that there's a lot more attention nationally being focused on automobiles, and not just cars, but off-road vehicles, mm-hmm. diesels, mm-hmm. tractors, all kinds of things which are being looked at very seriously. And recently, EPA has taken a position on what kind of sulfur will be acceptable in gasoline. And by reducing the sulfur content of gasoline significantly, it's going to show a very big improvement in terms of the air quality here in Iowa and across the country. It's a very big step that EPA took with a lot of opposition. The automobile companies were in favor of it. They were mm-hmm. supporting this move. Some of the oil companies were not very pleased with it.
To have to make that change. What about increasing fuel efficiency standards at the federal level? Is there any thought about that? I mean, I think there's thought about it. It's certainly a hot political issue.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of steps being taken with automobiles. For instance, low-emission vehicles. Mm-hmm. You can buy low-emission vehicles in Iowa right now, and they meet a federal standard as to what is a low-emission vehicle. They have some very interesting work being done with electric cars, using natural gas, and some other things which tend to, fuels which tend to burn cleaner than gasoline.
Ethanol's obviously been out there as one of those proposals as
Yes.
well. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that issue. That's an interesting question right now in Iowa.
I think there's a lot to be said from an economic standpoint for producing ethanol in Iowa. Obviously, it helps our farmers in the time when they need help. From a pollution standpoint, it might marginally improve air quality in the state.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about cars and mobile sources. Let's talk a little bit about area sources, those small sources that lots of communities have, and dry cleaners and body shops. What are some of we didn't really talk about the specific constituents of gasoline, but what's the major concern of gasoline before we move on?
Well, just a couple of things. Benzene. Okay. Benzene, when you pump gasoline and you smell that aroma, gasoline, you're exposing yourself to a known cancer-causing agent, benzene. Now, we have a lot of suspected cancer-causing agents, but benzene is a known cancer-causing agent. And chloroform and formaldehyde are both byproducts of combustion, incomplete combustion in our engines. So there's a lot of things like that. There's some other more exotic chemicals that come out too, but I think those are the three that people may have heard of.
So some states I've been in, you pump gas and there's this big nozzle and you capture the vapors. Is that something we ought to be thinking about here in Iowa?
I think somewhere down the road that's something we need to think about very seriously in the state of Iowa. I'm not sure that we would advocate a retrofit on existing gas stations, but quite possibly make that a requirement for any new gas stations that go in.
That's a great idea. That's an interesting idea. Area sources are the smaller sources, dry cleaners.
Yes.
What are some of the contaminants, pollutants that come from those sources?
Well, carbon tetrachloride is you associate with dry cleaners, although they're moving to different chemicals now. But again, when you deal with solvents, you have toluenes, xylenes, and things like that that auto body shops may have in there when they do painting and things of that kind. Gas stations, as I said, when you pump gas, you put something into the air. You have vaporization going on. And there's some ways you can deal with that. We're not, I think it's important that we approach this problem very carefully, so that we make sure that what we're doing is actually improving the air quality. And that means that as far as DNR is concerned, maybe we need a little more time to look into this problem than we have in the past.
Sure. We'll talk a little bit more about how do we get a handle on this in a second. The final area of sources are those fixed sources, those stationary sources, factories, different industrial capacities or processing facilities, utilities. What else would be in that category? I suppose that's the big stuff.
Yes.
Cement plants.
Cement plants, yes.
What are some of the major contaminants from those facilities? And
well, I think it depends on the facility itself.
Sure.
When a utility burns coal, it's probably emitting mercury into the air. And mercury is a contaminant that we have to deal with nationally. Last time I was in the Boundary Waters, one of the most pristine parts of our country. There were all kinds of advisories on fish consumption. About 2/3 of the lake, they had advisories against consuming the fish because of mercury contamination.
Wow.
And it's not naturally occurring. What happens is it gets burned, it goes up in the air, and eventually falls down. And it's bioaccumulative in fish. It keeps building up in their system.
You think the Boundary Waters, you're kind of getting away from things.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Except for that stuff that floats up. So we're in this situation in the state where people, I would suggest that most people think, gosh, we got great air quality here in Iowa. The data don't suggest that. If every county in the state exceeds the CPA criteria, how do we get in this position? Why is it that we're in such tough shape?
Well, I'm not so sure that we have degenerated into something. I think this has always been the case in Iowa, and that I think to a certain extent DNR has had its hands tied in the past as to letting people know about this, and that's changed, and so this information is coming out, and some people think, oh my gosh, what's happened? Well, I think it's always been there. And now we're just learning the extent of it.
So it's changed in that the last 11, well, gosh, we're in the 12th month now. The last 12 months we've had, I assume you're talking about, we've had a new administration under Vilsack-Peterson that have been more open to letting the department look at these questions.
I think that it's been evident to us that Governor Vilsack is very interested in environmental issues. And one of the first things he did in terms of the environment was to form a task force of citizens to look at the problem of air toxics. And we're just now have completed a rough draft of a report that we hope will go to Governor Vilsack, say, in the next month or so.
Good. But just to put a more maybe numerical face on this issue, right now Iowa ranks about 23rd or 24th in total emissions of toxic air pollutants nationally. So think of Iowa, we think of ourselves as an agricultural state, not necessarily an industrial state, but we're pretty high up in that ranking. In terms of how we've addressed it historically, we've ranked anywhere from 50th to 47th to 48th to 49th in per capita spending on dealing with air pollution. So it's kind of no wonder we've got a lot of sources, and then you figure automobiles. When I talk about 23rd or 24th, I'm talking about stationary sources mostly. That we haven't been focusing the resources that we need to financially on the questions.
I might add that we rank at the bottom of the heap in per capita spending on all environmental issues, not just air quality, but water too. And this has been a problem. I know I sound bureaucratic when I say that we've had to wrestle with this problem for some time. Just to give you a rough idea, as far as our staffing levels go, Iowa has one staff person for every 5 major facilities in the state of Iowa. Nationally, it's one staff person for every 2 facilities. And in some places, states have one staff person for, or 2 people for every major facility. So we're small, but we're good. So we try to get done what we can.
Good. We're about halfway through the show. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We're talking about air quality in Iowa, and believe it or not, we've got some significant air quality issues to address here in our state. Our guest is an expert on the topic. Iowa's the actual leading expert, I would suggest, Peter Hamlin. He's the Air Quality Division Chief for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. We've just been visiting about some of the issues in the state. Pete, in terms of, we've just talked about what resources are out there. One of the areas, and maybe we could get this up on the screen, is the whole question of community right to know that came into being a few years ago, where we've decided at the federal level that citizens would have an opportunity to gather information for themselves on what's going on in their communities. There's a number of websites out there. The one that we've got posted is scorecard.org, and it's a place where you can go and you can look up the industrial facilities in your town and find out what they are emitting. How effective do you think the Community Right to Know Act has been for Iowa in reducing pollution?
I think it's been very effective. I think it's effective in 2 ways. First of all, citizens now, if they're interested, can find out what's going on, not just in air, but in other areas too. But I also think more importantly, it's raised the level of consciousness among the industrial side, that the private sector, the regulated public, is much more aware of the fact that this information is going to be out, and that they want to do everything they can to see that their facility does not get adverse publicity. And I think you can see since 1990, in particular, a very big drop in hazardous air pollutants that has been done by the private sector on their own without any requirements on our part. And there's been a significant improvement in that regard.
I might also add, halfway through, that our guest also believes, I hope you're sitting down, that air quality is a bigger issue in Iowa as it concerns human health than concern about water quality, which is an amazing thing to hear. It shocked me when I read that, Pete.
Well, I think it's true. I think it's very true.
One of the, in addition, one of the things we saw with Community Right to Know, which is something I worked on back in the late 80s, early 90s, is you know, the kind of the public pressure that's out there when that data is published in the paper about the emissions from the local facility. There's no law saying they need to reduce emissions, but kind of the public pressure, the kind of public image that one has is emitting chemicals that cause cancer is not a good thing, and they've tried like heck.
Yes.
We've had a number of companies in Iowa, Monsanto, Alcoa, to name a couple, that have done their own voluntary reduction programs that have been huge.
Yes, John Deere's had an amazing program that way too.
That's correct.
Most of the really big companies have taken these kind of steps, and it's made a real difference in terms of what they emit. And lots of times they find that it's cost effective and even saves them money.
Pete, one of the things that happened in 1991 that's alluded to in this story is that Iowa quit regulating toxic air pollutants in Iowa due to a decision by a judge, I believe. And we haven't, I guess, officially had an air toxics program in Iowa. What's been the consequences of that? We still have regulated these facilities, but what should people take away from knowing that we haven't had that program in place?
Well, I think it's one of the consequences. Some of the consequences would include the fact that we don't know what kind of emissions are coming out of fixed facilities and what impact it may have upon people living around the facility. I think that's a legitimate concern on our part, and I know the regulated public has concerns that they don't want to be obviously creating problems. We don't know the extent of the problem in Iowa. We don't have monitoring, such as the state of Minnesota does. We don't even have an emissions inventory on who's emitting what. That's something we're starting to do now, and we're in about a third of the way through the process. We also need to do some more computer modeling to find out exactly where the hot spots are, get some predictions on where we should be focusing our attention.
So in what particular counties, we've talked about every census tract in the state having some sort of deteriorated air quality. What for our viewers across the state in different cities, which I assume more urban places are probably a bigger problem where they have more industrial capacity and things going on, what are some of those counties where people ought to pay some closer attention to this?
Well, what has happened is, as part of this EPA study, we have listed out the counties in which the highest monitored value for this air toxic was predicted. And it's not always urban counties, such as Floyd County is predicted to have the highest value for trichloroethane. But mostly it is the larger counties, such as Polk and Muscatine, Scott, Lynn, Story, Woodbury, Johnson, Pottawatomie, Sioux, Dubuque, so that in these counties, for at least one of these 23 chemicals, and sometimes more than one, they have the highest predicted value from this computer model.
So those folks living in those counties are at a greater risk, potentially, of an adverse health effect from an exposure to these materials.
Yes.
Maybe we could say that, but we don't. It sounds like we just don't have enough information.
I'd feel much more comfortable if we took this modeled predictions and had monitors out there to make sure that the predictions were accurate. Then we'd have good, solid information on which we could base some kind of program. Again, we're focusing in on, it sounds like we're focusing in on fixed facilities, but the reason that we have these chemicals all over the state that are causing problems, again, goes back to transportation.
Right. Cover your ears now, viewers. It's cars and trucks that are causing our air pollution problems. Pete, which is about 60% of the sources. You noted earlier the governor has established a task force earlier this year to basically begin to look at what should Iowa do with its air pollution problems. What's the status of that task force at this point?
We have a rough draft of a final report, which will be going out to the task force. and they'll have an opportunity to comment on it, review it, and comment on it. Once we get their comments, we hope to have something in the governor's hands, say, by mid-January. And then he'll decide how he wants to handle it.
Mm-hmm. So would we anticipate in that you talk about monitoring, some proposal maybe to begin the establishment of some monitoring locations around the state?
And we think that the report will have recommendations that we do some more modeling and some more monitoring,
okay,
and that we complete our emissions inventory so we have a good idea of what's going on across the state.
Well, the governor's off to a good start with the support of, obviously, the legislature on the water monitoring effort. We're just this year creating for the first time a fairly comprehensive approach to monitoring water to kind of assess where we're at. It seems like the same is in order for our air quality issues.
I would think so. Yes, I would think so.
That would be great. So in terms of what average viewers of the program, what advice do we have tonight on how they might get involved in this issue?
Well, I think one of the things is to look at the website that we mentioned, Scorecard, and seeing what appears to be the problem in their area. And also, I think we have to be very conscious of how we use our cars.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, can we get that website up and just burn that website right into the furniture of our viewers?
Yes.
That is a nice site. I visited recently because I had need to. I was looking up some information here in Johnson County, and it was very descriptive, what chemicals, how many pounds, as reported by companies. It's been the right to know. A lot of it was right to know. An additional issue that's just come up recently is the amount of chemicals stored in Iowa on site for various production facilities. And we rank number 2 nationally in the amount of chemicals stored on site. And then most of that, I think, is like fertilizer production. What's your take on
propane and agricultural chemicals and ammonia and all those kind of things? If you take away the ag segment, we're about where we are in the population, around 25th in the country. So a lot of that is with propane and ammonia and things of that kind, which still are potentially dangerous chemicals if you don't handle them correctly.
So you've been involved in environmental protection work for almost 3 decades. How do you think things have changed over time in that regard? I
think one big change, and a very positive change, is more of a non-confrontative approach in dealing with problems. There appears to be a much more willingness on the part of the regulated public to work together, and it's something which we are very conscious of at DNR, something we want to stress and emphasize in the future. It makes my job a lot easier, and it certainly is very well received by the regulated public. I also think we're finding a lot of problems that we never knew existed 20 or 30 years ago.
So Governor Vilsack has proposed a new initiative, and one of his agenda items for next year is more accountable state government and, you know, more consumer-oriented service. How do you think that's? Are you prepared for that? Are you going to be prepared?
I'm looking forward to it.
Good.
I think it's something which we would welcome, and I look forward to getting it implemented.
So you have a new boss in Director Johnson. He's been very busy putting his legislative agenda together there. Anything stand out for the air programs at this point?
I think that Paul Johnson has had a very positive and immediate impact upon DNR, and particularly in the environmental area. And he's always challenging us to find the problem, to look in a very broad perspective at problems, and I think this is very healthy for us.
Very good. Pete, we're down to about the last minute. Any closing thoughts on how we can work together to solve our air quality problems in Iowa?
Well, I think if someone is really concerned about the toxics, that you got to look for this report that's coming out, and I'm sure it'll get some play in the press and probably end up over in the legislature. And we hope something positive will come out of that.
Very good. Pete Hamlin, Bureau Chief with the Air Quality Division, Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Great. You've been watching Iowa News and Views. We've been talking about air quality in Iowa, which is a significant concern to people in the know, something that we need to begin to focus more of our state resources on addressing. Pete Hamlin's doing a good job of trying to get our attention on it, and we'll look forward to bringing updates to you in the future about this issue. Thanks for being with us. I'd like to thank our contributors, of course, and our sponsors around the state, as well as our hard-working crew for putting the show together tonight. Have a good holiday season, and we'll see you in 2000. See you next time.